Hello, I'm Anita McVeigh, and this is the Iran War Today, bringing you up to date with all you need to know on the US-Israel war with Iran. Let's start with some of today's key developments. The US Treasury Secretary unveils a new wave of sanctions against Iran, aiming to sever Tehran's links with the global economy. The new sanctions package comes as Iran's rial currency hits a new record low against the dollar. Diplomatic efforts to restart peace talks continue behind the scenes as Pakistan's army chief visits Tehran. The US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has unveiled a new wave of sanctions aimed at severing Iran's links with the global economy. Mr. Bessent said other countries would be put under pressure to cut economic ties with Tehran, and those that didn't comply would share its isolation. Have a listen.
Beginning today, the actions of Treasury and other agencies will tighten the noose and block every potential source of revenue that funds the IRGC and the evil Iranian regime. We are enforcing a zero leakage approach. There will be no minimal breathing space for the regime to rebuild its capacity to inflict terror against America and the world.
Let's go straight to Washington and speak to our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman. Tom, this was billed as the single greatest financial offensive ever. What did you make of what Scott Bessent had to say?
Well, it was billed as that. In terms of what's been actually announced today, it certainly is not that. Although, you know, there was this sort of huge threat hanging over this that the Treasury, the US Treasury is saying will still happen if countries don't do what they want and completely isolate Iran from the US dollar system and the broader global economy. What we have had announced today are a series of sanctions, some individuals and companies being designated by the US Treasury. Now, these are in three main areas. One is about the proliferation of ballistic missiles that the US says some entities are helping Iran do. The next is about what they call a malicious cyber group that has been helping Iran attack US critical infrastructure. And then the third is this key thing, which is around Iran's ability still to sell oil globally. And what the US says it's doing there is sanctioning 60 brokers, individuals and other firms that aid in that process. What this is not, though, is what had been threatened, basically, which is something far bigger, which would involve, for example, the US sanctioning larger Chinese banks that the Americans say are helping Iran to refine crude oil in China, for example, sell its crude oil to China. We haven't seen that. And so I think, you know, there was quite a lot of questioning of Scott Bessent from the journalists in the room saying, you know, you've threatened one thing and then you haven't done it. The answer to that from the administration has been, well, you know, we're making this threat. We're talking to the president is talking to world leaders to try and further isolate the Iranians. If they don't do that, we'll go to these further measures.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom Bateman there. So do sanctions like the one Scott Bessent is threatening to impose actually work? Let's get some analysis from Javed Salahi Isfahani, professor of economics at Virginia Tech University.
They work very well in hurting the intended target. Iran's economy has done poorly since sanctions tightened in 2011, but they did not achieve their ultimate goal, which was to get Iran to change its policies vis-a-vis the United States. I think there's always this optimism that US dollar is so strong, is so much needed, and the US economy is so big that a small country like Iran would be devastated with these. And you could not miss the gravity of the intended policies from the voice of this Treasury Secretary. It was clear that there was something new was coming in. But I fear that Iranians may not hear it that way because they've heard worse threats, like wiping out their civilization, and they have survived. So in a way, this might be a good thing for them that the US is no longer talking about additional weapons, additional destruction, but has gone back to economic sanctions as something that Iranians are familiar with.
So which countries stand to lose the most from Mr. Trump's latest attempt to squeeze Iran's economy? China, which is Iran's biggest trading partner, has been by far the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, despite sanctions in place since 2019. It's been going on under the radar, even though Chinese state firms have officially stopped buying Iranian crude. Last year, Chinese purchases of Iranian oil averaged 1.4 million barrels a day. The US is already sanctioning some 40 Chinese shipping firms and vessels for violating sanctions. The US naval blockade has drastically cut shipments via the Strait of Hormuz. Well, here's Javed Salahi Isfahani again.
It has been trying to pressure China, but China continued to buy oil from Iran. And US was unhappy about it, but didn't do a whole lot about it because China is a big trading partner with the US. I think they export $500 billion worth of goods, so they're not going to break that relationship over Iran. I think that Iranians also see China as a strategic ally, not a formal one, but informal, in the sense that China depends on the oil that comes from the Strait of Hormuz. And if Iranians are going to have some control over it, China would need Iranians to allow ships heading to China to bypass the strait.
Iran has dismissed Bessent's comments and said it would shut down all oil exports from the region if the war continues. The regime already faces tough economic sanctions from the US. In April, Washington launched a wave of sanctions on foreign banks and firms doing business with Tehran. Iran has vowed to fight back, issuing a new warning to shipping not to pass through the Strait of Hormuz without its permission. 1/5 of the world's oil and gas usually passes through the waterway south of Iran, but the flow has been effectively blocked by the country since the conflict began in February. Meanwhile, Iran's oil minister has announced the discovery of a new gas field containing more than 7.5 trillion cubic feet of gas.
By God's grace, we were able to add to the country's national wealth by discovering vast gas reserves in a field in the south of Fars province.
Well, despite having the world's second largest proven gas reserves, Iran has struggled to develop them because of sanctions and technical challenges. The International Monetary Fund forecasts that Iran's economy will contract more than 5%. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has acknowledged that the country is facing persistent economic problems, including inflation pushing up food prices and unemployment. Have a listen now to some messages sent to us by people inside Iran.
The depreciation of the rial is really shrinking people's dinner tables. They say it has got no impact, but how is that even possible? We're feeling it with every single fiber of our bodies.
Iran has been living under sanctions for years, and people have become accustomed to this situation. I'm sure Iran will find other ways to continue trading. Of course, there will be some impact and the economy may weaken, but that doesn't mean it will collapse.
It's not just about Iran. I do business with different countries, and if every country that trades with Iran is at risk of sanctions, I have to think very carefully before making any deal, because I could end up losing money.
Let's speak now to BBC Persian's Bahman Kalbasi. Bahman, tell us more about reaction from Iran to Scott Bessent's announcement.
The spokesperson for Parliament, the chief negotiator, Mr. Ghalibaf, had a tweet in just about half an hour before Scott Bessent started speaking, and basically, saying that these threats are not going to change our calculus, but more importantly, assuring that Iran's partners, trading partners, without naming them, have been in contact and told Iran that they will continue doing business with it. So obviously they are trying to show a brave face here and continue to insist that this will not change their calculus vis-a-vis the negotiations, whether they're ongoing behind the scenes or not. Clearly there are signs that that is still somewhat alive, but nevertheless the defiance is the message that is coming from Tehran that these sanctions will not change anything.
And Bahman, how significant in your estimation is that announcement about the discovery of gas deposits that we were just mentioning a moment ago?
I mean, The bigger problem Iran has already had for more than a decade is the fact that all the reserves that are in possession of the country or shared with Qatar or shared with Kuwait are not developed because of the sanctions. So the problem right now, and the immediate problem for the government, is being able to deploy technology to and then sell a product like gas or anything that comes from it. So the problem is much more immediate for them than what might be in reserves for a long term. The reality is these sanctions are not just affecting Iran's oil sector or gas sector, it's ordinary people who are paying the major price for it every single day. In the fall of the currency, we see people becoming poorer and poorer in the millions because of it. And the reality is that still hasn't changed the Iranian government's cost-benefit analysis of how to deal with the United States.
Okay, Bahman, thank you very much. Bahman Kalbasi from BBC Persian. Diplomatic efforts to end the stalemate between Washington and Tehran are continuing behind the scenes. Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir, a key ally of Donald Trump, has been holding talks with senior Iranian officials in the capital, Tehran, in an effort to help restart negotiations. Our Pakistan correspondent Carrie Davis has more from Islamabad.
According to Pakistan, this visit is about regional peace and stability. Pakistan has portrayed itself as being this intermediary between the US and Iran for the course of the last few months. And of course, the agreement that was signed between the two sides back in June was called the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, after Pakistan's capital city, where the two sides met in April. And the head of Pakistan's armed forces, Field Marshal Asim Munir, has often played a very key role in these discussions. He's been referred to by President Trump as his favourite field marshal. That field marshal is now back in Tehran. Now, as that agreement between the US and Iran has disintegrated, Pakistan has talked about the fact that it is still there, it's still engaging on both sides. And it was only recently that the Foreign Ministry put out a statement saying that they were doing their utmost to bring both parties back to the MOU and, in their words, remove all the irritants. Now, this might not be the only thing that is discussed during the course of this meeting between Pakistan and Iran. Pakistan has recently signed a defence pact with Saudi Arabia and with Turkey. That may well be discussed as well. And what are the impacts of that on the region? Many also point out that Pakistan is not the only party and the only country that is involved in discussions and has been operating behind the scenes. Qatar is often pointed to as well. This visit, I think, indicates that there's clearly still a diplomatic back and forth. But where does that go to? That is the question.
Let's take a look now at the bigger picture and how much of a difference this latest wave of sanctions will actually make. Let's speak to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner. Frank, so many questions arising from this. One of them is, for example, can the US really pressure China, for example, to go along with these sanctions? Also, when Iran says these sanctions, if they go ahead, we will make sure not a single drop of oil, to quote Iranian authorities, will pass through the Strait of Hormuz or indeed the Gulf. Is it really possible for Iran to follow through on that? Your thoughts?
I'll tell you what this reminds me of, Anita, is President George W. Bush, soon after 9/11, where he declared his war on terror and he said, you're either with us or you're against us. It's black and white. And of course, the Middle East isn't like that. It's so many different nuances and shades, but it does pose a big problem for a lot of countries because they don't want to be frozen out of the US dollar banking system. They want to keep that trade, but they also want to keep their trade with Iran. Can they do it secretly? Probably not. It's very easy for the US Treasury Department, particularly their counterterrorism investigators, to know exactly who is trading, who is doing business with Iran. And many of the people who are doing business with Iran are notionally allies of the United States. Now, the other thing is that I don't think the US is going to push this to the brink with China because they've got some key meetings coming up. The US still needs to get rare earths out of China. China pretty much controls the market, the global market in rare earth minerals. The US needs that. And China is not going to want to get into another tariff war with the United States. So there are reasons for the US not to push it too far with China. But I think with smaller countries and smaller businesses, it probably will try to do it. It's the natural evolution for the US. Having failed to win this war militarily, they've had some success economically with this chokehold on the Gulf. by putting this naval blockade, which is, there's no question about it, it's hurting the Iranian economy. But of course, all that time, there's still only a trickle of ships and goods coming out of the Gulf. So it's also hurting the US economy and the global economy.
In a line then, Frank, the degree to which economic pressure can cause political pressure, that's debatable.
I think it's very debatable because we've seen from the protests in December and January in Iran that the Islamic Republic will go to any lengths, including opening fire with live ammunition on protesters, women and children as well as men. It'll go to any lengths to keep itself in power. So they can take a lot of pain. Iran has been preparing for this kind of thing for a long time. They play the long game, and they are far better, far cleverer at doing this than the White House, frankly, who has been stumbling around for several months in this war.
Frank, thank you very much. Whether you're joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or TV, thank you for your time. We'll be back soon with another Iran War Today.